particular this. As John/Sarah today introduced me, my name's Gareth. I run a small big firm called Liberty Coaching. I'm terrible at writing bios for myself, as you may have seen on the invite of these sides of things. But one area which I've been focusing on a lot lately, based on the appetite of my clients, is this sort of employee advocacy area. It's an area which is it's both a boom, a nice little sort of boom for organisations when it comes to reaching our audiences. It is a little bit of a buzzword as well, and so not always used appropriately. And that being said, as you can see there from the bio picture, that picture was taken about 10 kilos and 2 COVIDs ago. So I've got the locks a little bit longer, but that's why these webinars are so much better. I don't actually have to stand up and people see the rig at the moment. Before diving into it, I wanted to obviously start with an absolutely horrific stock image here, but just tell a bit of background. So many years ago, I used to work in the consumer electronics industry. I was a product trainer for a very well-known consumer electronics brand in the laptop and tech space. One time I was actually visiting one of our clients, and they actually had a camera crew there from Channel 9. There was a program on Channel 9 that was covering a few technological movements forward in the laptop environment. I was the representative for our brand. I was there having a chat with the franchisee and the brand manager of that organisation. At one stage, they pitched the idea, Gareth, did you want to say a few words on the camera for this program to promote your brand and this product line? Based on the nature of that organisation, it then took about 2 hours worth of phone calls on a Saturday morning to get me authorised to even talk in front of the camera. That being said, at this stage, I would give presentations to auditoriums full of people. I was the face of the brand for most of for a very large part of Australia when it came to the tech and what our brand could do. But just to get a 45-second slot on this program that was airing, it took an awful lot to get that authorized. It took an awful lot of hoops to jump through just to get the tick box so I could say the spiel which I'd said 10,000, 30,000 times before that. Obviously, that's about 8 years ago now. And one of the challenges, probably the first point I really want to start on, is that at the moment, every employee is a spokesperson. Whether you're a small brand, a large brand, whether you've got 10 employees or 10,000 employees, every employee is a spokesperson. Obviously, typically we can talk about it offline. That's in the face-to-face environment. They're obviously that spokesperson. But now when we're talking about these digital platforms, it's even more important. Previously, the organizations I've worked for, if you were going to be a spokesperson, if you're going to front the media, you had to go through a couple of hours worth of training. You had to make sure that you knew exactly how to answer the questions. And also, obviously part of that is also which questions to defer. And make sure that you had a very articulate way of saying things that was very much in company line. Obviously, we don't offer that and extend that training to everyone in our organisation, which is a bit of a challenge, but we need to understand that with the nature of these channels, with the nature of where we are in 2020, every single person in our organisation is that touch point. And we need to accept that because otherwise doing the old ostrich and sticking our head in the sand is going to be a bit of a challenge for us. So introducing that concept called employee advocacy. Now I'm talking about this obviously within the context of social media today. And so employee advocacy boiled down is just the promotion of any organization by its staff and internal stakeholders. Now, obviously this can be a massive benefit for us. You know, we're talking about not just from a marketing point of view, but also from an HR point of view, promoting the brand, the employee workspace, the EVP, all those sorts of things. Our employees are we always say they're our biggest asset. We always talk about how valuable they are, but now they really are that mouthpiece as well. Employee advocacy, obviously we're talking about it as an active principle today. That being said, you've already probably got people talking on your behalf from within your organization already. So ideally what we want to talk to today is making sure that we harness that properly. We understand that every internal stakeholder is a spokesperson, and how to harness that correctly, but also direct it in the right way and get value out of it, as opposed to opening ourselves up to risk and worry. Just starting at the top, there's the 3 C's of social media. So I'm not too sure if anyone knows these, but they are children, cupcakes, and cats. And so obviously you had to have very early on an image of a cat, or else you wouldn't believe that I'm in the social media space. off the back of talking about employee advocacy and off the back of talking about the fact that everyone in your organization is a spokesperson, a lot of us can feel like this, whether we are the brand manager, the social media manager, the HR manager, or the CEO, because there is that concept that, if everyone within our organization is talking on our behalf and is effectively an unauthorized representative in some cases, it can be a little bit scary. To that point, I want to talk about the different platforms very, very quickly and how they sort of play into space. On the left, I'm going to talk about some of those more personal platforms, and on the right is those networks which we tend to align very much with that concept of employee advocacy. So when it comes to things like a Facebook, Pinterest, even Instagram, they tend to be those networks that people use individually for that personal discovery. You follow your friends, your families, and a couple of brands you like. Whereas when it comes to particularly LinkedIn, but also Twitter to some degree, that's where people use those platforms a bit more, whether actively or very passively, from that personal branding element. So these are probably going to, LinkedIn and Twitter are going to be the networks which I'll reference a little bit as we go through today. That being said, I have worked with brands where they've used their employees' Instagram accounts for that employee advocacy, obviously depending on whether it aligns itself with their strategy and also how those employees use those networks. There are some inherent risks when it comes to platforms like LinkedIn and Twitter. One thing I'd say on this in this capacity is that people are very easily identifiable and searchable. And that sort of plays right back into what we're talking about when it comes to every person being a spokesperson, because even if they are not using these platforms deliberately to talk on behalf of the organization and to talk as an employee advocate, they naturally are, because they are identifiable as people who work at our organization. So as we step through, I will focus a little bit more on the Twitter and the LinkedIn side of things, based on the way those networks particularly work. But that being said, probably not a Tumblr, but an Instagram and sometimes even Facebook's when it comes to those groups are definitely platforms that some organizations can leverage employee advocacy. I did mention first off that identifiable side of things. Here's just a quick snapshot of my LinkedIn profile. And as you notice, it's got the brands that I work with. So I'm on the board of a small charity called Realize, but obviously I also operate my own business. That means that if I'm talking on this platform, if I'm talking on LinkedIn, if I'm engaging with content, whatever the case is, when people click back to me, it's very obvious that I'm a representative of this brand. And that's one of the most important things to realize, without wanting to sound too dodgy and too creepy, although I get the feeling I'm probably going to accidentally do exactly that. I am absolutely pro-serious when it comes to stalking people on these networks, and a lot of people are. And that's one of the things is that, you might think that you've got your Facebook settings locked down and that, when you do something on Twitter, you've got that wonderful bio where it says my views are my own. You're always going to be searchable, and people are always going to be able to find out which brand you're aligned with. So if you are talking about your industry, if you are talking about your competitors or your own organization, you're very, very much identifiable. Obviously, that's particularly important when it comes to the space of LinkedIn. If people are adding their employer to their other networks and saying and showcasing they work for that organization, that means that anything they promote on that network is intrinsically linked to the brand. I will take this opportunity as well just to say, if you do have any questions as we go through, I had two apologies, and I've got a couple of questions that I've already had shot through to me, but if you do have any questions, throw them into the chat in the side, and we can kick through those as we go, as well as at the end. So that's a little bit of a space on employee advocacy, what the space looks like at the moment. And obviously, to that point as well, we even see trends like boxing, which is that element where people find things that people have said and then out them in their workplace. So we need to understand how open these networks are and how they operate. So moving in, I couldn't find a better photo to articulate this, but I did want to talk about that double-edged sword of employee advocacy, the reward and the risk. So what better way to kick through it than with art? First and foremost, one of the massive benefits of employee advocacy for an organization is that employees tend to have typically 10 times the audience than a brand does. So if you think about the people who work for your organization, typically on the social channels, they will have 10 times the audience that the brand would have. The first social media agency I worked with, our LinkedIn channel had about 400 people connected to it that were following and waiting for those brand messages. between myself, the MD, and one of the sales guys, we had about 10,000 collectively. And so that's a larger example of that. That's one of the big challenges, big opportunities for us, is that if we are going to promote messages around our organization, if we do want to talk about the amazing products that we have, the work that we do, whatever the case is, our messages, then our employees have massive brand reach compared to what we do on our own channels. That's obviously a fantastic way to amplify our messages about how good our product and brand is, but also, once again, when you're talking about from an HR point of view, how amazing our workplace is. From that personal branding element, we do want to be able to promote the fact that we have a fantastic work culture, and we are very process driven, whatever the case may be. And this employee advocacy showcases the reach that we can get through our employees' channels. I'm going to move to the flip side of that, but before I did, I just wanted to quickly show you a screenshot to sort of illustrate a few things. Now, this is actually where I posted the link to today's webinar. And if you drop your eyes down to the bottom, there's, I'm sure Sarah won't mind me outing her. But as you can see, Sarah's commented on it. She's gone, looking forward to it, Gareth. She says that, but she's not here, so don't know what to make of that. But if you notice underneath her name, it says President of the International Social Media Association. Now, this is an amazing opportunity and challenge for us. And the fact that even just from a commenting point of view, Sarah is linked to ISMA. Right then and there, she's keenly identifiable as the president of ISMA. So even if our internal audience aren't posting, they're just commenting or engaging on content, we need to be aware of what they're doing in that regard as well. The nature of social media channels, they use algorithms, and effectively algorithms are just ways that they make sure that your newsfeed, when you pop onto that network, how it curates that content. For those who do use LinkedIn keenly, you will notice you actually see quite a few stories in your LinkedIn feed of posts that your connections have commented on. So you might not actually, as an example, some of Sarah's connections who are not connected to me on LinkedIn might have seen that she's commented on there. As opposed to Facebook, where you can limit it to just your friends who see your content. It is a very open network. So when you are publishing this content, unless you change your privacy features, it is open. So it's great, once again, opportunities for, as we're posting and engaging with content, to promote the talent that we have and the content that we have and the messages we have. But it is open, and it means that it is pushing out one extra connection beyond that. So as an example of the challenge that will cause for us, here's just a post which I picked up in my newsfeed about a week or two ago. So a German IKEA donated its car park for the Mass for the Id prayer. Obviously, coronavirus, social distancing, all those sorts of things, allowing people to have a large space. This was just one of the least awful comments on this post. Obviously, I've blacked it out from what the person stated. Ignore Amina. She's just she's more commentating on the comments. This is an example of one of the risks that we open ourselves up to. If our audience, if our internal stakeholders are on these networks and engaging and commenting, they may not be aware that people outside their network are going to see this. They might not be aware. The person who commented, "No more shopping at IKEA," there's a good chance that their network is going to see their comment on this post. And obviously then, like I said, they're intrinsically linked to their brand. So this could be a reputational risk for our organization. So yes, we've got a great reach on these networks. We've got 10 times the amount of reach that our corporate channels might have. But when it comes to, obviously, the nature of that commenting, the nature of that engagement, we want to make sure it's above board and aligned with our code of conduct, etc. But also, we do lose a little bit of control of that message. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to try to make sure we can build processes so that we're getting the benefit and not the negativity. To this point, I don't think I could push any further if I didn't bring up this example. I won't talk too much. I believe Sarah said that there was even an ISMA event around the Israel fallout element, and I won't voice my opinions on it. But what I will say is that I would challenge every organization to think about how they would have handled the situation. If it was one of your employees and they had gone on LinkedIn, posted something similar that might not sit with the values of your organization, how would you manage that? But also, not just managing that crisis, but looking forward and going, well, great, how can we put in processes and systems so that it doesn't happen? And so we'll talk to that in the last part of the webinar, but being aware of that. This is obviously a very extreme case. The nature of Israel Folau's channels, he has millions of people following him on all these different social media networks. So obviously that's an inherent challenge, but then also any amplification of that. So it's really important to be aware of what the worst that could happen. And obviously, like I said, building in processes to make sure that we can avoid that. The other real benefit is the authentic voices that employee advocacy creates. This is a little bit of a stat from Bamboo, which is Sprout Social is a social media management tool, which does a lot of analytics and everything like that. They also have a program which allows you to harness employee advocacy. One of the other key takeaways is that authentic voice which employee advocacy allows. People are 16 times more likely to read a post from a friend than from a brand themselves. This shouldn't really shock anyone. We obviously like to hear the content from our peers, our families, our friends, as opposed to being hit with effectively what is advertised, what is commercial messaging. Obviously, this does extend to social media advocacy because people are more likely to read it, to be accepting of it, and to be understanding of it when it's coming from a connection on LinkedIn or someone they follow on Twitter or a friend on Facebook. This also plays into the fact of the way those networks and those algorithms work. Obviously, people are more likely to actually read it, but they're actually way more likely to see it. Facebook and LinkedIn actually prioritize content from family and friends or from your connections before you see content from brands. So these networks are actually deliberately designed to showcase more content from from people as opposed to brands. So not only are they more likely to read it, but they're more likely to see it and then obviously acting on it. This goes down to word of mouth, something that we talk about within the context of marketing and HR. It's one of the most important things. There's networks out there like Glassdoor where people can gripe about their previous workplaces. So having a proper strategy around employee advocacy means that you're more likely to get that message in front of the right people and also be able to leverage your audience, your internal audience's networks, and in an authentic way. That being said, once again, the flip side to the authentic voices is the inauthentic voices. We'll have to go down the rabbit hole to get to the example that I'm talking about here, but 2018, there was a case where a Cricket Australia employee was sacked for comments that she made on Twitter, which were effectively seen as criticising the government. Her name was Angela Wilson. It's a very well documented case, so I won't go too deep into that. But one element that sat behind it, so Angela was outed as having made some very anti-governmental messages on Twitter, criticising some policies. One thing that came out in that process was that there was actually a Tasmanian government employee who was removed from her role as well because she had used fake accounts to troll people who criticised the government. Now, this actually really, it's been around for about as long as I can know social media networks, not just the ones that we know today, but in even examples like Whirlpool, etc. So the inauthentic content is going to be such a big challenge for us. We want to make sure that not only are our audiences leveraging their networks and engaging with their the people that are connected to them, we want to make sure that they're doing it in an appropriate way. This is obviously also in line with things like the ACCC. We want to make sure that if our internal audiences are commenting and engaging with their network and talking about our brand, they're not doing things such as saying negative or untrue things about competitor brands, etc. It's really important to realize that you've got the authentic voices, but also you need to make sure that you protect yourself from inauthentic voices. Fake accounts are really not that challenging to overcome. Like I said, it's very easy to find out who the real people are behind fake Twitter accounts, fake LinkedIn accounts, etc. So it's important to make sure you have a positive attitude when it comes to using employee advocacy and not using it in that underhanded way. And to that point as well, I've worked with brands where they've had a crisis. They've had a social media crisis where people are criticizing them on social media, particularly on Twitter in that open space. And the employees for that brand who love the brand dearly come in and they go into bat and they come across and say, well, listen, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a dickhead, you're a whatever the case is. They use conversation tools that are very much off brand. And all they do is open us up to even more risk. So And when we talk about how to use a platform, it's also as much about how not to use them. Make sure that we understand that, that we do have a corporate comms team that will be able to respond to those sorts of things, and that our internal advocates, whilst we want them to talk about the brand in a positive way, we don't want them to put the boot into our naysayers to try to have a big in return at some of the trolls that we might find on the network. So that authentic content and making sure we protect ourselves against those inauthentic voices as well. So that might have us once again freaking out. There is that challenge, obviously. Like I said, everyone is already a spokesperson. Whether or not you've actively rolled out an employee advocacy program, if you have people who are active on LinkedIn or Twitter, then they are already building their personal brand and they are already advocating for our brand. So it's about kicking back and working out how we can dive in and work that out. Cool. I'm just going to dive in. So I've got a question before I continue on. So what do you do as an employer or board member when employees openly comment against the values of your company? Two scenarios: pro Black Lives Matter, anti Black Lives Matter. That's a great question, Ellen. So that's a really common sort of thing. It comes down to, what do you do when you've got rogue employees? What do you do when you're being challenged in this capacity? I think first and foremost, and I'll talk to this in a moment, it has to be a systemic element. And this goes right back into even hiring processes. Your culture needs to be appropriate within that regard. You need to make sure that people are on brand, that, when we're hiring people, we're hiring for attitude. This is my personal opinion, starting from a systemic point of view. But moving on, the next section is that education, educating your internal stakeholders, educating your employees and board members on how to use the platforms and also how open they are. Most people don't realize that when you comment on a post on LinkedIn, that you can actually find that. You can easily find what people have commented on. And so they might not realize that when they are either making pro or anti Black Lives Matter comments, that they are completely visible. So educating your internal audiences about these networks and how they operate. But I also like to, put on the end of that, always go at the carrot and the stick. And what that is within that context is going, great, these are some areas that we want to talk about on these networks. Yes, of course, there are your own channels that you have your own voice, but also bring it back to that code of conduct. This is no similar to people who are, bad mouthing people on a train whilst they're in a branded T-shirt. Back in my retail days, there was quite often the case where we'd have to let people go who were, whether it was smoking or being abusive, who had done so within the context of being in a shopping centre with a branded T-shirt for that retailer. So you need to make sure that obviously those sorts of challenges have already existed. We just need to make sure that we implement the exact same stop holds when it comes to social media as well. And I will come back to that question as well in a bit, Ellen, because there's a little bit more content on that. There we go. This used to be our advice. So when I first got into social media, this used to be our very simple advice when it came to employee advocacy. Never post anything you wouldn't want your mum or your boss to see. I am self-employed, so tick box for the boss, and my mum's pretty much given up on a lot of the things I do, so tick box for that as well. But we do need to go beyond that. So I do want to talk about, how do we set ourselves up for success when it comes to employee advocacy, and how do we build this beast in a positive and useful way? First and foremost, and I know Sarah talks to this a bit when it comes to a social media policy. A social media policy is absolutely vital when it comes to any organization these days. But that being said, not all social media policies are created equal. The first social media policy I saw was about 2 lines long, and it basically equated to don't dick around all day on Facebook. That was about it. It was just talking about how you would use social media while in the workplace. But obviously now we need to provide some education around what social media platforms are there, how they utilize, etc., but also how people should interact with the brand on those networks. This will play right back into that question. When it comes to cultural elements, how we do interact with the brand by way of what you are and are not authorized to say, but also what our expectations are when it comes to things like a code of conduct. Similar to the fact that a social media strategy should not be separate from a marketing or a business strategy, a social media policy should not be created in a vacuum. It should be aligned with your induction and code of conduct content. I won't go into it too much because I am not a lawyer, and so when you want advice in and around that, I would, obviously consult HR and their guidelines. But obviously, social media policy is there to protect the brand, when people are promoting content and social advocating for you guys on social media, you want to make sure that, first and foremost, you are protecting the brand. You also want to empower staff. And I think that's a really key thing is the social media policy isn't about this is what you can't do, this is what you can't do, don't do this, don't do that. It's also about empowering them. Empowered staff on these networks are going to give you that amazing leverage. They're going to be able to talk to the networks in that authentic way and get that 10 times reach we were talking about earlier. And obviously that legal element, which, like I mentioned, I'm not a lawyer. I will not provide legal advice lest we all get sued here on this call. But you do want to make sure that that social media policy is in line with the rest of your employment policies. I did use the term systemic, which I think is one of my favorite words of 2020 for a variety of reasons. But one of the big elements to being successful when it comes to your employee advocacy programs is having a systemic culture of wanting to share content, wanting to share positive content. And that also stems from the channels and how we utilize and promote the amazing people within our organization. It's not just simply going out to our internal stakeholders and saying, here, share this content. This is this amazing diatribe we want you to put over the top of it. We want you to talk about how amazing this product is and how much of a fantastic workspace it is. It needs to come from an internal culture. And so you can't just try to utilize and leverage these platforms without making sure that's actually part of your organization's backbone. So obviously, far be it from going down the rabbit hole, talking about what makes a great cultural element for an organization, I do think that just within the context of employee advocacy, making sure that you promote the people who are doing it well. Make sure that you call out your LinkedIn or Twitter heroes who are really doing a great job of showcasing what your organization is doing correct, etc. And make sure it's built into the way that you and your teams operate on these networks, and that there's constant touch points to make sure they're also getting the right content and right support to feed their networks and channels. So social media policy, the cultural element, and finally, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but no, come on, let me go to the next slide. There we go. But also stakeholder education. So your employees or your volunteers, whatever type of organization you work for, it's important to make sure you educate your internal audience on social media advocacy, but also a few other elements. First and foremost, privacy and mechanics of these networks. If people don't want to be that identifiable, there's different ways. Obviously, you can lock down your Facebook page, you can close off your Instagram or Twitter, etc. Even when it comes to LinkedIn, do you want your profile picture to be seen by people who aren't in your network? Helping educate your internal audience about how these networks work from a privacy point of view is vastly important so that they feel more comfortable, understand the network. But also, like I said, the mechanics of it, that algorithm, the fact that if they do comment on a particular one of their connections posts, that will be seen by their network as well. So making sure they understand how these networks operate so that they make sure they don't end up in one of my slide pieces eventually. Also the inherent risk. I think, like we said, we talked about that. That's going to really fold into a lot of those elements within your social media policy. But I believe it was Sarah who's one of the first people that told me, make sure that, if you do have a social media policy, you are educating your audience on it. You are training them on your social media policy, because the best one in the world, if it's put in a drawer somewhere, is not going to hold up. So make sure they understand the inherent risks around social media and social media advocacy. It would have been so much better if I had spelled inherent correctly there, but it's okay. We'll truck on. I've noticed that I've fallen on my sword there. But make sure they've got a good understanding about how these networks operate and what that means to them as an individual as well. And this one's just behind a little, but also the value. I think, once again, I mentioned earlier, I don't just focus on the stick. I think focusing on the carrot is very, very important when it comes to mobilizing your internal audiences on these networks. Focus on the value of personal branding. I think it's one of the big tidal waves at the moment is people building up their personal brand within an organization. For an organization, if your audience is seen as thought leaders, as amazing individuals, and have got high personal brands, that bodes incredibly well for the organization. And obviously for you guys, helping your internal audience build their personal brand means that they're going to have strong networks, they're going to have strong communities on their own channels and be able to leverage that themselves. Some people come back and they criticize it and they say, well, if you help build up your employees' personal brand, what happens if they just leave? And I feel like that goes right back to that old quote from Richard Branson about, obviously you train your you train your staff so they can leave. You treat them so well they don't want to. I'm obviously paraphrasing the great man's words there. You want to make sure that you do encourage your internal audience to understand the value of developing their personal brand, of posting the right content, of engaging well with their network, so that they are seen as an authority, but also a trusted advisor within their chosen spaces. So I think those three things are really important when it comes to educating your stakeholders to make sure they can actually operate and actually utilize employee advocacy in an appropriate way. So I think we've sort of kicked through. If anyone has any questions, fire them through. But I think the key takeaways I want everyone to walk away with today is, first and foremost, is that thing I started with at the top of the webinar, is that everyone is a spokesperson. That might scare us. It should scare us to a degree, but it is a great opportunity for us to get that larger reach. And if we do it well, we will still control our brand identity. As I mentioned, your internal audience is a bigger and more authentic voice. I want to put that underline, and the authentic voice. This is a great opportunity for us on these platforms, is the fact that, by the way, like I said, trying to promote our brand, our product, or our workplace, our internal audience has a much bigger reach than we do, and people are more likely to believe it and actually read it. Build a systemic culture of leadership and employee advocacy within your organization. Make sure that it is part of the way that you communicate with your internal audience and with your external audience. Make sure that that's actually one of the core elements to the way that you go to market and engage with your audience. And finally, continually educate and empower your internal advocates. So obviously education, that needs to be ongoing. The networks will change, different networks will pop up. Obviously we've got things like TikTok. I should have called it the TikTok to try to showcase my age there. But you've got platforms like TikTok. Privacy settings of these networks change quite regularly. So make sure that you're continually educating your internal audience on how to utilize them. But also, like I said, empower them. It's much better if you give them the ability and the capacity to exercise their authentic voice, rather than, once again, floating with what you should not do, what you cannot do on these networks. So they are very much the 4 key takeaways I'd love you to walk away from this session with. If you do have any questions, feel free to slap them in the chat box now. Let's see if I did have, that one was ticked off. One question I did have from someone who couldn't join us earlier was, do you vet your content from your employees before they share it? I'd say it's a very interesting question. So knowing exactly who it came from as well. So do you vet your content from your employees before you share it? I think that personally comes down to the training and helping people really harness and understand their personal brand. You won't be able to vet the content from what they share on all the different networks. And you just, in a lot of cases, you might get pushback from your internal audience if you do try to. So I think what the best approach for that is, obviously not trying to lock down and minimize what gets put out on these channels, making sure that you're working with your employees and promoting what is the best type of content to share on these networks. Like I mentioned, that might even be explaining and sitting down as part of training, going, well, Twitter will utilize this for engaging with media or other stakeholders, whatever the case is, and LinkedIn is where we're going to engage with a particular different type of audience. So really setting aside time to make sure that you promote and you set a good framework for your internal audience to use these networks. Cool. The only other thing I could think of is when it comes to the different platforms that people might utilize when it comes to employee advocacy. As mentioned at the top, you've got typically the main networks that people utilize for personal branding, employee advocacy, etc. First and foremost, most definitely LinkedIn, because you are, as mentioned, intrinsically linked to your brand. All someone needs to do is navigate back to your page before they can find out more about you and where you're at. But also Twitter, it tends to be a very open network, so you can actually obviously connect with a wide variety of people. You don't have to have someone in your network or be a friend to be able to tweet at them, which is why Twitter can quite often be one of those platforms that people utilize for employee advocacy. That being said, once again, the inherent risk is it's completely open. Cool. Got a question from John. Can you comment on the difference between company brand views and personal views, and how to help employees see the difference? Yeah, I think that's always a big challenge, particularly early doors when we began to realize that LinkedIn started as pretty much just an HR tool, right? People would sit there and they would they'd put up their CV and they'd hope that, a hiring manager or their ex-partner would come across and be really amazed at what they're doing. But these days, they are content networks, and now people are utilizing. They go, no, this is my social media network. It has nothing to do with the organization. So that's a challenging thought process that's come out in the last little while. But I think first and foremost, it is really making sure that ideally, if we can, we hire for attitude. But I think it comes down to education about letting them know how those platforms operate. When it comes to those company brand views versus personal views, ideally, hopefully, they're usually a little bit more aligned for us. I think what that then, if we do have some employees that do have different, and that's great, that's fantastic, is showcasing them how to share those views in ways that don't contradict or contravene brand views. And if they do, well, in which case, similar in line with our code of conduct, when I say, well, listen, this does contravene the way that we go about things. Obviously, that's we get very much into a legal element there, where when it comes to whether or not we can sack employees or take any sort of dispensation against them. I can't comment on that because I don't even know what the actual outcome of the Israel-Folau side of things was. I know that was settled off-site, but when it comes to that legal element, it's obviously a very tricky element, which is very much a moving part at the moment, particularly here in Australia. Jan, any insight from the Chinese language platforms and any differences to the US-led ones? So I'll talk to the two main ones, which is WeChat and Weibo. Weibo is a lot more open. So it is very similar to almost like a hybrid between Twitter and Facebook, and the fact that, it operates a lot more like Twitter. It's searchable, it's visible. So once again, obviously on those networks, people sharing that content is very, very visible. Particularly, obviously, you still have a bio on, on Weibo. So it means that if you are identifying yourself as an employee, it can be utilized for those networks from that employee advocacy point of view. And anything you say untoward could therefore still be linked back to the organization. WeChat is very much like it's a bit more of a messenger service. So people can still share content through there. And so it's still a great way if people are utilizing their WeChat account to connect with businesses. You can still share content through there. It's harder to track from an organizational point of view. So it's harder to go, yes, they're doing a great job or doing a poor job, because it is very much similar to messenger services. I guess in one of the typical ways that we might utilize, say something like WhatsApp, where we might have a group message with suppliers, or we might have it with external stakeholders. It's important to make sure that those platforms still then need to be moderated, so that if we do have a thread called Levity Coaching Heroes, if there's anything that's derogatory or defamatory in those channels, then I'm still very much responsible for it, and so they need to be managed appropriately. But I dare say that when it comes to those Chinese language platforms, Weibo would probably be the most likely to be utilized. I'm not too sure if it's part of your strategy by way of a wider communications one, but one of the important elements on that is when it comes to understanding what's input on there. Jan, I'm not too sure if you're a native Mandarin speaker, if you've got a good handle on the language. But one thing that I found out when I was doing some training on Weibo is that Google Translate does not usually provide the sort of resources we need. So if we are trying to see how people are promoting us or what they're saying about us, some typical inferences won't come across properly. I take that smiley face as that you are a native Mandarin speaker, or you're fluent at least. So congratulations. I only speak the one language, which is probably an indictment on my efforts as a young man to try to learn French and Japanese. Awesome. Well, I guess that wraps us up. I guess moving forward, one thing I'd encourage is if you do have any questions, feel free, as is, I guess, the nature of this platform, feel free to connect in with me on LinkedIn. If you do have any questions, flick me a direct message and I can answer any questions that might crop up in the next week or so. I believe the webinar has been recorded, so if you really enjoyed my dulcet tones, I didn't throw in too many jokes. Like I said, I only moonlight as a comedian, so I can't say it's a successful platform for me yet. But feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and if you want to revisit this, I believe it will be published on YouTube from memory, John.
Thank you very much indeed. Does anybody else have any last questions, as we do have a little bit of time left?
No worries, Paul.
No? Thank you, Paul. So in which case I'll do a formal thank you to Gareth. That was certainly a very, very useful 45 minutes, and you can't say that about every Zoom conversation that we've had in the last 3 months now, can you?
Yeah.
It sits as part of ISMA's education program. We started off with real events where people actually had a drink, and then we moved on to online events over the last 3 months. So keep an eye on our more online events. We've got quite a few more planned. Keep an eye on the ISMA website, and I hope to see some of you at a future event. Once more, thank you very much, Gareth.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Okay.
Rock and rolling.
Rock and roll. Saying goodbye. That was actually really, really good.
Ah, awesome. Glad to hear it. I tried to tone down my
I'll just stop the record. I'll just stop the recording.
just in case I say anything. Yeah.
No,